this session, we will focus on the process of organizing for teaching. My guess is that if we had a conversation and I were to ask you when your next class started and when it ended and when there were holidays in the midst of that time period, you would be able to give me all of the details. You'd be able to describe for me the big picture of the next course that you're going to teach. And that's important to know. But one thing that is equally significant is to think about the 4 hours you're going to be spending with your students every week in a classroom. Those 4 hours can seem like 40 hours or 40 days if they're not planned well. We've all had that experience of looking out into the faces of our students and seeing their eyelids drooping, or their heads dropping, or them staring off into space. I'd like to share some strategies with you in this session that might alleviate that situation. There was an article written a few years ago by Smith, Shepard, Johnson & Johnson, where they described what they call the bookshelf approach to planning an individual lesson. So think for a moment about planning ahead for next week's 4-hour teaching session. How might you go about doing that? What they suggest is that you begin each class with something called an advance organizer. That could be a video clip. It could be a story from the news. It could be a poem. It could be something that you read in a professional journal. Something that sets the stage for that particular class. Think, for example, about sitting at home in the evening watching television when a movie trailer comes on. What movie producers have become very good at doing is including in that trailer, in that 30 seconds, all of the exciting, provocative scenes that lead you to the conclusion, I need to see that movie. That's what the advance organizer does for your class. It sets the stage. We've included some resources along with this video to give you some ideas on what advance organizers might look like and how you might use those in the class. But that's an important place to start, to capture the attention of your students and to give them a taste of what lies ahead. Smith, Shepard, Johnson & Johnson then suggest that the remainder of the class be a combination of lecture, videos, or demonstrations, followed by processing activities. So there's certainly a role for faculty to lecture in the classroom, to show videos in the classroom, to do a variety of things to get information into the hands of our students. What these authors suggest, however, is that we should also intersperse processing activities that allow the students to chew on the information, to talk about it, to wrestle with it, to find ways to connect it to other things they've learned. The authors also suggest that the final activity of the class should be something called a cohesion builder. If you think about any class that you're teaching, whether it's 1 hour, 2 hours, or 4 hours in length, there are some key points that you want your students to walk away with. The cohesion builder provides that opportunity to our students. It allows them to think through what we've been discussing and to bring out and capture the most salient critical points that they need to take away from that experience. Again, we've attached some resources that will give you some ideas on how to conduct cohesion builders in the classroom. A different way of looking at this is the rule of 10 and 2. And here's the idea, that for every 10 minutes that I talk, lecture, showing a video, sharing information in a monologue kind of format, I need to provide at least 2 minutes of time for my students to have a conversation about that content. Turn to your neighbor and talk about this. Gather with a group of 3 or 4 people and wrestle with this question. Whatever that process might be, we need to intentionally embed opportunities for students to wrestle with, process, and engage with the content. That's the rule of 10 and 2. I would even suggest that 2 minutes should be longer than 2. Perhaps 10 and 4. Now what that means in the long run is that we are talking less, but facilitating more as we go through those 4 hours. This is Edgar Dale. He was a media specialist at The Ohio State University. And during his time there, he created this graphic, later called the cone of learning. The idea being that the information at the top, verbal symbols, visual symbols, recordings, and so forth, are things that we remember the least Things at the bottom of the cone, contrived experiences, direct purposeful experiences, are things that we remember the most. Now, you've probably seen this in a variety of formats. Quite often it looks like this. And if you just simply Google cone of learning or Edgar Dale, you will see hundreds of different versions of this graphic. What it suggests is that we only remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, and so on. Those are passive learning strategies. What we do remember more, however, are the things that we do in an active way: writing, saying, or doing. Now, one of the things that intrigued me about this are the sources of these percentages along the side of the graphic. I went back to Dale's original research and found that when he invented the cone of learning, he had no intention of including the percentages. Somewhere along the way, that's been included. But intuitively, it makes sense. If you can imagine, for example, reading a passage in a book or reading a passage in an article, thinking it's very important, highlighting it, putting stars around it, writing notes in the margin, what is the likelihood that you'll remember that piece of information? I can't tell you how many things I've highlighted over the years and never have remembered them. On the other hand, if I go to work the next day and have a conversation with a colleague and bring up that article and that passage, and we debate over the viability of that content, I am much more likely to remember that in the future. That's the point of this graphic. Students will remember more in terms of what they say or do as opposed to what they read or hear. So sadly, they remember very little of our lectures. We, however, can change that by creating learning activities that engage them in conversation and processing of that information. So we're moving from a point where what has been formerly called the sage on the stage. I will stand in front of the class for 4 hours. I will profess to you the most important things you need to know, and you will go on your merry way remembering every bit of that. That probably is not the case. We're moving now to a model called guide on the side, where the faculty member becomes a facilitator, an encourager, a creator of learning experiences. Students not only learn from what they glean from the faculty member and lectures, but also from what they can glean from conversations with their classmates. And as you look at this model and think back to our conversations earlier, the diagram on the right, the guide on the side model, is much more compatible with andragogical teaching than the sage on the stage. We intentionally engage our students in conversations and opportunities to wrestle with content and difficult areas of concern. A few years ago, Wiggins and McTighe wrote a book called Understanding by Design, and they identified what they call the twin sins of traditional course design. So as you think about your class, reflect a bit on the manner in which these two twin sins interact with your teaching. The first one they describe is what they call activity-oriented design, hands-on without being minds-on. This is the idea of engaging students in activities in the classroom that could be very much fun, engaging, exciting, interesting to do, but have very little to do with learning outcomes. They're more entertainment-oriented than learning-oriented. Now, I would suggest to you that it is highly probable that you could create learning experiences that are both fun and at the same time reinforce the learning outcomes for your course. But both those things have to be true. Just having activities that are fun or a break in the action is not sufficient. The second of the twin sins is the tyranny of coverage. This is the idea of marching through the textbook, making sure that you show your students every PowerPoint slide that you've created. In fact, reading them to your class, making sure that you cover the material. There is a clear difference between covering and learning. We want to get through certain amounts of content, but we need to be very careful in terms of determining how much of that needs to be presented in the classroom, how much of that can be allocated to reading outside the classroom. And finally, I'd like to share 6 rules of thumb. Number 1, talk less, engage more. If we adhere to the principle of 10 and 2, that is, for every 10 minutes that I talk, I'm going to create intentional learning experiences for my students where they have a chance to talk and process information, then I will necessarily be talking less. Don't think that you have to fill the entire 4 hours of your class with the sound of your voice. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Certainly you need to share information, you need to lecture, you need to provide content related to the topic of your class. But you also need to create meaningful opportunities for students to engage in conversation and process that content. Once again, we've attached some resources that help in that area. Number 2, value the experiences and perspectives of your students. Because you're teaching an adult learning environment, you have students with tremendous bank of experiences in a whole variety of areas. Find ways to engage those experiences and those perspectives. Some of the topics you discuss will be controversial in nature. Students in the classroom will have different opinions. Help them walk through those differences. Help them begin to find areas of agreement and disagreement, and then try to reach some consensus on those areas of concern. Number 3, share your stories. You too come to the classroom with a wide variety of experiences. As you plan the content for a particular evening, try to find 2 or 3 places where you could insert an anecdote or a story, personal or otherwise, that illustrates that content. The stories are what the students will remember. The stories are the places where students will make those connections. Number 4, ask good questions. As you think about inviting discussion in the classroom, avoid questions that have a clear, definitive answer, yes or no, true or false. Try to create questions that invite a variety of perspectives. It's a good idea before class, in light of the content that you're going to be sharing, to spend some time actually crafting the questions that you will ask in class. To try to do that on the fly, in an impromptu sort of way, often leads to questions that really don't invite much conversation. So spend the time generating those questions prior to the class. Number 5, listen and synthesize. As the class is discussing a topic, you will have a variety of perspectives presented. Your job during that experience is to continue the conversation, but also to provide points at which you share how those ideas and those thoughts connect with one another and connect with the content of the course. This is an acquired skill. This is something you'll need to practice. But once you develop that skill, your teaching will improve dramatically. And finally, think of the classroom experience as a way of adding depth to reading and out-of-class experiences. As you assign readings for a class, expecting your students to engage with a certain amount of content before they come to class, try to find ways to connect what you're doing in class with those out-of-class experiences. You know what they were assigned to read. It's not necessary to repeat that in class. However, you can ask questions, create discussions, create learning activities that help them process and engage with that information in a meaningful way, and one that will invite them to remember that information in the long term. We'll be back soon. Thank you for joining us.